think because of the world we grow up in around watching movies and reading books around intimacy, we have a very different expectation of what real intimacy actually looks and feels like. And never is that more true that there's a discrepancy when you have a more sensory avoidant profile. Now, this can be for lots of reasons, from autism to trauma or both, to different ways your brain responds in general to sensory issues. But specifically for those who have a lot of sensory avoidance, intimacy is filled with sounds and sights and smells and tastes and textures that you cannot avoid and easily turn off. So, if that is you, this is a good video for you to check out. I really do want to share this because I really think that so many people struggle in different aspects with these issues, and there's a lot of inherent shame around talking about it. So I'm going to start the video by going into sharing what it looks and feels like in every part of your body and experience, and then we'll go into what you can do about it. The more I do deep dives into understanding high masking autism, the more things are revealed to me that just make so much sense. And this particular topic I just made a TikTok about, but I really wanted to make a longer form video because I think it is such an important topic. It is specifically around high masking autism in women and intimacy, especially as it relates to being a sensory avoider versus a sensory seeker. So when we're talking about these different types of sensory issues, we can have one or both, where we're trying to really avoid the triggers of sensory dynamics, or for other reasons, we might be more sensory seeking, right? So we're trying to get the stimulation from a sensory experience. What this video is going to focus on, though, is what it feels like for you if you are a high masking autistic woman, or what it may feel like, I should say, around intimacy. This experience for us is something that no one really talks about. I think we're talking more and more in some social media areas around what marital coercion, around, these dynamics, and especially long-term relationships in the historical married department in terms of what's expected or not. And we don't talk about all of the things that can get in the way, not just long-term monogamy and boredom and the human brain being, both wired for stability and security, but also being wired for novelty. There are so many dynamics. And so I thought I'd share what I've come across in terms of what it can look like if you have a more sensory avoidant profile. You may also have or some form of trauma, clearly, that can add to these issues or create them. Anxiety, OCD, ADHD. There can be a lot of reasons why these things occur or they can co-occur with autism. But so far, this is what I've found. There's a whole area around the world of intimacy as it relates to autism, but it is still really a very limited area of research. So I could do lots of videos. In fact, I might make more. And before we get into it really quickly, remember that autism is defined by things like repetitive behaviors, social communication issues, sensory issues. These things alone, or if you relate to all of these on this list, do not mean that you have autism. I would use this, though, if everything is like a yes, to once again use to dive off on your own research journey and understanding what things you relate to and what things you don't. There is still right now a big division in, I would say, the therapeutic and psychological community around high masking, especially among populations that are anyone outside of being white males. What does this look like in people of color? What does it look like in women and girls, right? We're still at the very beginning of understanding all of this. And so if you're only using the DSM, you might find that none of these things seem relatable to you in terms of a diagnosis. But I think if you begin to expand and read books and look at research, watch a lot of autistic creators on different formats, listen to their lived experiences, I think if you take all of that together, it will help you understand this journey. All right, so that being said, let's get into it. Number one, if you have an issue like this, what often underlies everything is secrecy and shame and an internalized belief that you're the only one who's like this. Like, what's wrong with me? Okay, so that's really important to keep in mind. Number one, during intimate acts, you notice everything and you cannot turn off the noticing. And the noticing is more than just, oh, I noticed that. It is deeply upsetting, dysregulating, and triggering, but oftentimes you're having to internalize and mask all of what's happening. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the feel of a person's beard, smells, tastes, when things are moist in some way, like even that word, right? It's like you are triggered by the lighting, by the sounds that are being made by yourself or the other person. So it really is every part of the sensory experience. You're noticing that you can smell in their breath the breakfast they had or the garlic from last night. And maybe it's like being, muddled through the taste of mint, and you can smell the mint and the garlic or taste it. Like all of that is deeply dysregulating in your body, but you're not really able to deal with it. So you sort of force your way through it. But meanwhile, you're really triggered, right? Or dysregulated. Number two, the expectations of your partner in terms of frequency of intimacy, which every single couple has a frequency discrepancy in my experience. There are no two people that have the exact same desire for intimacy and on a time schedule. But it can feel like a demand. Now, maybe it is a demand. Maybe it's too frequent of a demand. Maybe it's not. But whatever it is, especially if you have certain types of profiles in autism, or any profile, frankly, but let's say you have a more PDA, a pathological demand avoidance profile. I'm not going to get into that now, but where things feel like demand. So that's going to create a lot of responses in you. And that can happen, without autism, for sure, but it's especially intense in this regard. The next thing is that the partner often, and this is a problem I think for many couples, doesn't take enough time to prepare and nurture an event, right? And this is true. I mean, of course, so many of these can be true for people who are neurotypical, but especially if you need to be in a certain, space and time and frame and mindset. If there's a demand and there's not the time to nurture and cultivate intimacy and the excitement and the arousal and looking forward to things, that can make it feel even more intrusive. The next thing is there can be an overanalyzing of the experience while you are having it, like while you're in it. It's like you're hovering over yourself, you can see your body, you're assessing yourself. It's a very intense kind of scrutiny on yourself that makes it difficult to be present in the moment. The next one is having to stuff down or pretend that the self-loathing of your own body or buried anger or resentments around yourself or your partner aren't existing. So there's no real space to process that. It's all kind of happening. And oftentimes I think even out of our awareness, these are, long-term experiences and patterns that we're trying to push our way through. The next one is pathologizing our issues and feeling bad about it, right? So if you have a lot of disagreements with your partner around intimacy-related things, sure, maybe there are things that absolutely belong to you, but because you've often internalized and blamed yourself for everything in this area, you have a lot of shaming and pathologizing. And, well, I'm like this because I have this experience, or I'm like that because of that. And that may all be true, but you often overtake the burden and feel really bad about it. And at the same time, you can be very resentful of the fact that you have to even be there, but you keep showing up in some way. Most people know that, at least in my experience, when there is no longer intimacy and one of the partners wants it, eventually, unless they both are okay with it, something happens. I'm not going to go into justifying why or why not, because I think that's a different conversation, but people tend to seek it in other ways. They often seek it in great connected relationships. People who are happy also seek other people, going back to the brain being wired for novelty and stability. But this isn't about that. My point is that you feel that pressure. Society tells you you're supposed to do certain things. Your partner tells you, you feel it, you know it, but that can create its own blocks to connection and resentment. And often resentments too, let's be honest, about all kinds of things in the relationship. Events, how the partner treats you, talks to you. So it's not just this area, but this definitely enhances it. The next one is you often feel like what's happening is a performance. So you are performing for your partner. You're doing the things you're supposed to do, but because it's difficult to be fully in your body, and we'll come back to that, it often feels like you're watching yourself or you're just going through the motions to present yourself in a certain way. Especially if you're a sensory avoider, because you're trying so hard to mask everything that's coming up for you. The next one is you're often unsatisfied with the experience, and whether it's because of the sensory dynamics, because of the demands, whatever it is, because you have a hard time maybe verbalizing what you want, or your partner doesn't seem interested in knowing what you want or trying to make things go well. That often is like you go through the whole thing and afterwards you're like, wasn't that great, didn't feel that great. The next one is you're overstimulated before, during, and after the event. And so if you've been masking through the whole thing, oftentimes when the partner is now maybe sleeping, people will say that they often feel very triggered and stimulated and they can't go to sleep. Their body has just endured something, to be quite frank with you. And so there can be a lot of just brain stimulation happening, which can make it very stressful afterwards. Or maybe you have insomnia, things like that. Or you're judging yourself, overanalyzing. There's a lot of, self-judgment going on. The next thing is you often feel like you're agreeing to keep their partner happy and their mood okay. So if you are very sensitive to slight shifts in a person's mood and mind, and it might be a marital coercion situation where it's like you have to give in or the partner doesn't treat you well or has conditions. But because of that, you feel like that you have to say yes. And so you're subsequently triggered and angry and doing all of that. But you're doing it because you're trying to manage their mood. Once again, these don't have to be related to autism, but are going to be even more profound, I believe, in these profiles. The next one is the sounds your partner makes during the act are triggering and overstimulating. And you don't want to say something like, that thing that you do that it shouldn't matter really bothers me. The sound you make with your mouth, the sounds your body is making in some way, or whatever's happening, the smells, the tastes, all those things are triggering. And it can be really hard to be honest about that because unless the partner is really compassionate and motivated and patient and willing to understand, it can feel very personal to them and you don't want to hurt their feelings. And so you keep holding it in. The next thing is that you feel like you might need to numb and use substances. So a lot of people talk about needing to do something beforehand, whether it's drinking, smoking, whatever it is, using something, because it's just too much to be in their, non-substance using mind to engage, which is fine, relatively speaking, I suppose, if everyone's okay with that. But it can become a problem if you can only engage and then it creates a substance issue, things like that. The next thing is you feel extremely uncomfortable, potentially, with eye contact. And some people want to have very intense eye contact during these moments. And you don't want to say no, that's too much for me. And in fact, one of the recommendations was to find ways that don't require that for you. But once again, that can be even a trigger you're not even aware of. You just feel very uncomfortable. Along those lines, we can see things like experiencing, and this is really defining all of this. It's called intimacy overwhelm. So whatever it is, all of these things are overwhelming. That's really the bottom line. You can often be triggered by the setting you're in, by the environment. Maybe for you, having an intimate moment outside of your own bedroom is very difficult because of the lighting, the sheets, the fabric, the texture. Maybe there's a candle burning and the smell bothers you, but you don't want to say anything, right? So the environment itself can be very restrictive or triggering. The next thing is you're often told to just be in your body, right? Just enjoy it, just be present. But that can feel almost impossible when you have all of these other things going on for you. Of course, there's a lot of overthinking about how it looks and feels, which leads to a lot of internalized shame about every part of it, right? So it's the visual, it's the environment, it's the triggers. So a lot of that can also create dissociation, where you feel like you're there but not there, or you are dissociating during the act in many ways, or during these moments. You can feel guilty for doing that. You can feel guilty for fantasizing in a way that maybe that's the only way you can be in that environment is through fantasizing, and that feels really bad. By the way, lots of people have fantasies with other people while they're with the same person. Not every single time necessarily, but you're allowed to have whatever you're having in your own mind. That's a different conversation, but it can be very common. You often have a threshold at how much you can tolerate. So maybe your partner has a different time preference in terms of how long things go on, but you don't want to say, this is too much time for me, but there's this threshold you reach. And maybe you just like get frustrated or irritable or whatever it is, but you're not really aware that that's what's happening. You often can feel touched out, and this is especially common if you have kids, right? So all day, when your kids are little especially, they're touching you, they're holding your hands, they're laying on you, and depending upon your own tolerance for physical affection and touch and stimulation, they can just be way too much. And I'm going to keep saying it, and this is true even if you're not on the spectrum, but it could be especially true if that kind of stimulation is a lot for you. Of course, in the beginning of relationships, when the dopamine is flying and everything is great, it's easier to overcome some of these things in that novelty part. But as time goes on in traditional longer-term relationships, it can be really hard to not get so triggered and then to feel really bad about it. Like, what's wrong with me? Why was it okay in the beginning? Well, that dopamine was often overriding a lot of other things in the moment. And it was new and you weren't quite able to, you were maybe really masking, and now you're not masking as much in your own home, but everything is really percolating for you in a way that's difficult to manage. And the last part of this is that as a result of all of these things, and that you are much more likely, especially as a woman, and by the way, I didn't say this, but these can all happen regardless of how you identify. It doesn't matter who you are. And because we know that women with autism are significantly much more likely to be on the receiving end of traumatic, intimate experiences for many reasons, often repeated ones. But even if you didn't have trauma around this area, all of these things can make a situation where intimacy feels traumatic almost every time for some reason. You're not able to voice what you want or need. Your body is having all of this overstimulation. You feel guilt, you feel shame, you dissociate, whatever it is. And at the end of the day, that can make all of this really, really difficult and hard to work on and even to verbalize. So, like I said, what can you do? I'm going to link the articles down below where I found this information. You can go and read them. Of course, there are also other things to be done. But I think in terms of understanding, well, what could I control? What might I be able to work on? This might, I hope, be a good place to start. Remember that talking to your partner is really such a large part of this. And I know that can be an awkward conversation to have. Hi, Coco. You want to say hi to your friends? I don't think Coco's been here for a while. Is that you want to talk about consent, about agreement to things. An ongoing communication around these issues is going to be vital to any possibility of success, alongside patience and compassion, and really an understanding that there can be a threshold if your partner struggles like this or if you do, and to stop shaming yourself or them around it, to embrace it, to try to work with it, and understand that sometimes you can do everything right and it's just not going to work. Okay, that's really important. But that the goal is, if you want to be intimate with someone who has these dynamics, or you do, the goal is connection. The goal is not only one act equals completion of the task in terms of what we're supposed to do. There are many ways to experience connection in an intimate way. So that's really important. And the last thing I'll say too is remember that people who might struggle with this dynamic don't necessarily love surprises. So even though we complain about, things get boring, it doesn't mean you can't take risks. But with certain profiles like this, you might have to talk about how to get spicy in advance, if that makes sense. Because what we really can feel out of control around is a trigger we can't stop or weren't expecting or don't know how to engage with in a way that's helpful. All right, so as I just shared, there are a bunch of different ways these things can affect you. Let's go through each of the different senses and how our bodies can be, especially while this can be in anyone, male, female, or however you identify. The articles I found were directed at women, and I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. There is some more research on males and autism, and and thank you, Coco, and intimacy, there's very little when it comes to women. There's different variations of understanding how we show up, but not a lot about the actual experiences, or at least not enough. So these were written by different people who are also either experts or autistic, okay? So the first area is tactile, which means touch, right? So when we're talking about touch, what we're really talking about often is too much or too little. So we're talking about things like hugging and massage and any kind of embracing that might really vary for you or your partner depending upon where you are in your responsiveness to sensory sensitivity around avoidance. Now, there can also be sensory seeking. That is not, Coco, that is not what this video is about. Hold, please. Okay. So what can you do? Keeping in mind, number one, that a person with some kind of sensory sensitivity around avoidance doesn't like surprises and kind of needs to know what's going on. The first recommendation is that you kind of try to keep the person in your visual field so that they can see what's going on. Now, that might depend upon the lighting, which we're going to come to later, but the core of this is staying within the visual field so that you kind of can see and know what's going on. If you were going to use something like a blindfold, that would need a lot of trust and a lot of agreement up front, because while that might feel like that could numb some other senses, it actually could be a very big trigger in terms of safety. So generally speaking, unless you've agreed otherwise, something like that where you can see the person and you know what to expect. Obviously, discussing number two, pressure points. How much pressure? I like this much. I don't like that much. These spots are more sensitive. These are not. I know it feels like unattractive to think about these conversations, but nothing is more attractive than feeling safe in a situation if you want to be able to open up and be vulnerable, right? The next one is to look at temperature issues. Is it too warm? Is it too cold? Do you need fans? Do you need heaters? Do you need to use blankets or covers in some way? There is nothing wrong with that. It's just about knowing what happens, because let's say you get cold easily, which can be very common with like Raynaud's disease, where you get cold and now all you're focusing on is that. And it's even harder to be present in the moment. So looking at the temperature issues. Number three is looking at textures, fabrics. This would not be a good situation in which to buy new sheets right before an experience like this, right? So what does the bedding look like? What do the pillows feel like? Are these comfy and soft sheets? Do I need to change that? And don't, like I said, start with something brand new unless you've like worn it in some way in terms of washing. That could be fabric softener that will come back to smells, but like all of those things can be hard to avoid when your body is wired to pick up everything. The next one is, I'm going to have to try to say this in a way that this works, is the exposure to things that might have moisture in them in some way. So lip gloss, other things that facilitate connection or protect. And so the recommendations are to maybe not use lipsticks or lip glosses, to use liquid items in certain ways where they are basically on the outside of things, not on the inside, things like that. So I'm not going to go too far into this one, but you know what I mean? The idea is that the way something feels, sticky, uncomfortable, whatever, can be very triggering. And you really can't avoid a lot of these in some situations, but other ones you can. So it's important to talk about. Number two, vision. This connects, right? So lighting, maybe using things like candles, having a window, just the window light coming in, dimming the light bulbs. Maybe it's no light. Maybe that's what you prefer. But this can be very triggering, especially if you're in an environment where the lighting in and of itself is bothering you, but you're afraid to say something. So at the same time, remember that it might be, while the window is open or there's light coming in, the person that you're with might have a real sensitivity to someone seeing in the window. And so even though you think you're letting the moonlight in, they have a fear they can be seen. So you want to be away from the window, but letting the light pour in, things like that. Many people prefer more clean and minimalist environments, so obviously trying to maybe reduce the amount of items in the space you're in. Of course, this depends on your own preferences, but a lot of clutter, a lot of, overstimulation, literally with all the things, might be very hard to not connect to in those situations. So look at the amount of clutter in your environment. The next one is no new environments. Many people that have these issues, they need to know what to expect, right? So it sounds exciting, but maybe lower your expectations if you're on a trip. Maybe modify what you're doing on a trip. Ideally, you would discuss this beforehand so that there's a safety around that, right? But understand that as exciting as the brain is motivated to be around new environments, if you have a lot of sensory triggers, maybe you're in a hotel and you can hear the fan running or the neighbors are having a party. Maybe the bedding smells weird or the carpet, right? The bathrooms. Hotels have a vibe, for example, or an Airbnb that can be very triggering. And like I said before, the blindfold situation would really depend upon your own comfort and a high level of trust and a prior agreement. And certain things like eye contact for many people is very triggering and not comfortable. And a lot of the previous advice on, romance and connection even including myself, has been around eye-to-eye, face-to-face contact. But as I've done more and more work in this area, I've realized in terms of neurodivergence that for many people, that's just not going to work. And so you want to talk about that, find other ways to engage. One of the suggestions was to engage in your bodies in a way that didn't necessarily have to have eye contact. In some ways, kind of depersonalizing it a little bit, that is too stimulating and too triggering. So being creative about how you might move your bodies in a way that reduces eye contact, or if you like that, of course, increases it. The next area is the auditory area, and this is what you can hear. So a lot of the advice is to create playlists with like building, pacing, background music that you like, that you can, you're not going to be like distracted by new music that has some invasive quality to it. Maybe it's the sound of the neighbor's TV or roommates, but the background noise can be a really triggering and important part of distraction for our sensory issues. So you want to try to control that as much as you can. Like many people already have a playlist for those kind of things, right? But you would want to ideally make sure you both are in agreement about what that looks like and sounds like. So along those lines, understand that sounds your partner makes can be very triggering, right? Even if they don't mean to. There are so many parts of our experience where it's our mouth or our body that is making a sound that can be very upsetting or triggering, or we can. There can be a lot of shame around that, a lot of wanting to dissociate from that, because part of the human experience involves those things. So you can't necessarily avoid that, but you would want to discuss. Maybe it's like something you do that they do is too long for that sound. Maybe you can tolerate that sound for a few minutes, but not for a long time. Coco, you're just determined to keep this spicy. Speaking of spicy, aren't you? So that's important. Another common dynamic I read and makes sense is that, especially if you are autistic, that sometimes going mute in the experience, whether you're enjoying it or not, just not being able to speak or vocalize or express, can just be part of what happens for you. And it isn't about your enjoyment or not, but we're wired to say, oh, you have to make noise and everything has to be a certain way for it to be enjoyable. And I think that can be a real problem for people, this expectation. The last recommendation in auditory is the possibility of using earbuds in some way if that is comfortable for you. So if it's good for you to have the sound turned down using earbuds and that kind of like heightens other senses, but the big one you have is sound, try it. It's worth it. It's worth a shot. The next area is taste. And so we're talking here about all kinds of things around taste, right? That can be very triggering. So to combat that, you might want to consider making sure you do things like brush your teeth, but maybe the toothpaste is too triggering. So maybe you have to modify the one you use on those events. Looking at things like candy or gum or mints. One author recommended Altoids specifically to kind of reduce that smell. You know, when someone has had a meal earlier, but you can still smell it in their pores in some way. But, looking at how you might mask that through gum, mints, candies, things like that. Sharing saliva with some people is very triggering, the idea of any of that contact. And so once again, even though it's hard to talk about, it might be that certain types of connection work better for you in terms of kissing than others. And so that's important to talk about and understand that anything to do with fluid, liquid, all of those may inherently be difficult. And so there are so many products. This is not my area of expertise, but I know there are many products that can be safely used to help with these dynamics. Certainly things like hygiene and all of that, we're going to come back to that. But that can make a big difference in terms of someone's triggers. In fact, showers and baths and all of that can be really helpful if your partner is easily triggered by smells and tastes and things like that. The next area is the olfactory, the smell area. And for many people, especially with autism, this one can be a very heightened sense. And it's very difficult to stop smelling something. You almost can't do that, right? So it could be that the person's perfume, their breath, their laundry detergent on their clothes, the foods they ate, their hair gel, their deodorant, their soaps are triggering. And so you might want to talk about what those are. It might also be that certain use of those help turn down the volume on other ones, right? So maybe it's deodorant and cologne that your partner has a big trigger around BO and they just cannot turn that off. And so ideally you'd want to make sure that those things are being compensated for with smells that are more pleasant to you. Consider using no scent detergents or soaps if that's a trigger in general. Like I said before, even the dryer sheets, if you're not used to that, can be, on someone's sheets, very distracting. And like I said before, the articles talks about using baby wipes or showering, bathing before, during, and after these events. And so even during might be the best, dynamic for you in some way around water. So we're trying to find the most ways to increase our experience of joy and pleasure and to reduce the triggers of our senses. And that's what really matters. Don't get hung up on what those things are. Just try to figure out what might be helpful for you. The last couple of things are the vestibular, which is basically your head position in space and how that can affect intimacy. And so what I read was that some people with sensory issues can struggle with understanding where their head is at in space, and they may become disoriented or sensitive to having their head in certain positions. So you'd want to communicate about that in advance and make agreements about what might be an option, what might not. Others might be seeking out those positions, right, in that more sensory seeking dynamic, but we're talking about avoidance here. So you want to communicate your preferences. Also understand that it's okay to take breaks and switch things up and to rebalance and realign and give yourself a break. In fact, taking a break can be very helpful at times. If you need to kind of like rearrange things, move some things, change some things to try to create more of a connection as your goal and not just the end game, if that makes sense. The next one is proprioception. So many people who have sensory issues can have uncoordinated movements and struggle to comprehend how much force they are exerting with their muscles. So if they don't have good or helpful proprioception for you, or you do, you want to talk about it, be cautious, remove items, try to be more aware of your body in space. The last area goes into interoception, and this is about how does the awareness of the sensations you're having affect the intimate experience. So those with interoception issues may have difficulty knowing when they're feeling things like hungry, tired, cold, hurt, warm, thirsty, or even attracted in the moment. And so we want to work on check-ins, trying to check the boxes with those things. If we know that not eating is actually a trigger later, maybe working on having a meal a few hours before, so you can reduce those other, smell-related dynamics. Asking questions like, are you comfy? Is this okay? Do you need to take a break? Do you need to readjust? Do you need to check in with yourself and help them do that? But also realizing that if a person you're with or you are has a difficult time with interoception, they may not realize that they haven't eaten all day, that they haven't had any water all day, that it's actually their feet are really cold right now as this is all happening and they're really uncomfortable. So things like that. Interoception awareness also impacts your ability to understand the emotional regulation of ourselves and others, right? So it's not just what my body's feeling, it's like what's happening between us inside. And so they can have a hard time really understanding not just their body, but the nonverbal cues of the partner. And so there can be trouble trying to make those assessments. Well, do you want this or do you want that? Or how do I feel? How do you feel? And this all goes back to so much communication before, during, and after. That's the truth. So the last few things I found were related to just a few other ideas. Number one, discussing all of this, of course, routines, flexibility, predictability, and no surprises, as I said earlier. It's really, really important. The goal is to connect and have pleasure in connection in whatever way works for you or whoever you're with, right? Number 2, understand and accept that your partner may have a sensory threshold. So you might have agreed to do all of these things and you might get halfway through and it might just be that it's too much. In fact, like I said earlier, many people talked about they mask through the whole thing and then the partner falls asleep and they're laying there, their mind's racing, their body's overstimulated, they can't sleep, they have insomnia, and they're trying to regulate, right? It's so much. They just push themselves to go through the smell of the sheets, the partner's breath, a taste, a liquid situation. Maybe their head was in an uncomfortable position and that's triggered something. Like it's a lot. And so that's really important. You may have to take a break and try again. Okay. Accept that there might be some important boundaries to implement that you don't necessarily like, but you love your partner and you want to have a good experience. And so some things have to be released and let go of. Other things are going to require experimentation or new types of ways of engaging. So that's really important. The last thing is, I don't know anything about this, but I did read it and then I clicked on a link. There are apparently a lot of apps. One of them is called Kindu, I guess, that talks about you can each of your partners fills it out, I believe, and they can list all their preferences from little things to big things. And maybe you share that information, right? Like, here's what I'm willing to do. Here's what I won't do. Maybe if it's hard to talk about it, you find a way to text it or use these apps, things like that. Another last few things were considering role playing and scripting, that for some people with autism especially, there can be a paralysis of choice, like it's hard to make decisions. And so scripting ahead of time, the repairman's going to come replace the refrigerator dynamic, right? Something like that, where there's a power imbalance. If it's a safe relationship, might be enjoyable. It might not, right? But the idea is that sometimes something like that removes too much, power differential dynamics to think about. And so once again, though, you'd have to be talking about upfront what that looked like, what it might feel like, what the boundaries might be, what the conditions might need to be. And that's just the reality of all of this. Like I said before, you just have to find ways to acknowledge what you feel and then try to share them with your partner. And frankly, if you don't want to do any of these things and you just decided that intimacy is just too much for you in this particular way, that's okay too. This isn't about saying you must push yourself through something that you actually don't really enjoy. And in fact, in many couples, if both partners don't necessarily have a super strong drive for certain types of connection, it's fine. It's only an issue when one or two or whatever's happening in the couple or larger relationship, one person wants more than the other. And in most relationships, and everyone I've ever seen, there's always going to be a frequency, demand, desire that's going to be different. So, for example, if your partner has sensory issues and you expect them to be ready to go every day, I don't know what you think is going to happen, but that's not going to go well. And what ends up happening, even if it's once a week and it's too much for your partner, this is not about debating what you get in a marriage in terms of intimacy or not. There's just been a lot of pressure about what we're supposed to provide historically. And so you have to figure out what works for you. That's the bottom line. But the problem with all of this is if you don't deal with these issues, and often in the beginning, it's so exciting that you're getting a dopamine hit and the partner's new and the brain's excited, that you can kind of mask more through these. But as your body becomes more comfortable and time goes on, intimacy can become very traumatic. The demand can feel like a demand and it can actually be in many relationships. This is a huge issue for many couples. And so part of the problem is if you have, no one likes to feel like intimacy is it demanded upon them. I mean, I don't care if you have autism or sensory issues or not, that's not going to go well. When we talk about things like marital coercion, all of these things are really important, like I mentioned, to understand that no matter what ends up happening, if you don't work it out and honor your partner and try to prioritize these things, intimacy becomes traumatic, not just with that partner you're with, but maybe with all partners subsequently. Because again and again and again, if you have this dynamic, you put yourself in situations trying so hard to push through it, to mask through it, to sacrifice through it, but the trauma of all of it lives in your body. Right? And it's really hard to repair that. It's possible if you already have trauma, for example, with all of this, to start over with your partner and to rebuild from the ground up. But you're going to have to start with looking at everything I mentioned today and whatever else I didn't. What are your issues? What needs to change to even consider the possibility of this being a more connective, safe experience for you and or your partner? Anyway, thanks for being here. I hope this was helpful. I know it was a lot, but I was going to make 2 separate videos. But when I do this, people say, I made the first video and they're like, well, what do we do about it? And so I can't always provide what to do about it because some things are frankly a lot more complicated. But I feel like when it becomes technique related, at least there's a place to work on this. And then obviously, if you have trauma around these issues, seeking help, books, support wouldn't be a bad idea, of course, because that's the other component. So anyway, stay safe and I will see you soon. Bye.